Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I'm the senior minister at Westminster Presbyterian Church in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and I'm the moderator of the forum. For more than 40 years, the Town Hall Forum has invited, let's go back and start over.
Right.
I got to get the name of the show right. Is that a better pace?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I'm the senior minister at Westminster Presbyterian Church in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and I'm the moderator of the forum. For more than 40 years, the Town Hall Forum has invited speakers of conscience to address the issues of the day from an ethical perspective. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have moved all our programs online. We look forward to returning to in-person events as soon as it is safe to do so. The Town Hall Forum has always offered its programs as a service to the community, completely free and open to all. That is thanks to the generosity of supporters. Donations from individuals make up 85% of the forum's budget. If you are able, we would ask you to consider supporting the forum, which you can do on our website, westminsterforum.org. We're pleased today to welcome author and historian Walter Isaacson to the Town Hall Forum. We would like to thank Minnesota Public Radio for recording and broadcasting today's program. We'd also like to thank our media sponsor, MinnPost, for their ongoing support of the forum. Walter Isaacson is a professor of history at Tulane. He has been CEO of the Aspen Institute, chair of CNN, and editor of Time. He's well known for his biographies of Leonardo da Vinci, Albert Einstein, and Steve Jobs. His latest book is The Codebreaker, Jennifer Doudna, Gene Editing, and the Future of the Human Race. In the book, he profiles Dr. Jennifer Doudna, the scientist who won a Nobel Prize for her work on gene editing technology called CRISPR, a tool that makes it possible to edit DNA the way one might edit a letter in a word processor. The book looks at some of the immense opportunities this technology offers. For instance, the science behind CRISPR was integral to the development of both the Moderna and Pfizer COVID-19 vaccines. And it poses profound ethical questions. The ability to rewrite the basic building blocks of human life means parents could literally choose genes for their children. At the same time, the book tells the story of Dr. Doudna and her rise to the very top of an historically male-dominated field of research science. Please join me in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's great to be with you. And it's important for those of us across the nation to say how much our hearts go out to you in Minnesota, a city that I love, is filled with really good people. And I know you're going to work your way out of this with help from Tim and everybody else. So thank you, and thank you for having me. Mm-hmm. I wanted to write about the genetic revolution, and that ought to cause people to scratch their heads a bit, because I've been writing about the digital revolution with Steve Jobs and the innovators, and before that, the scientific revolution with Einstein and Ben Franklin and Leonardo. And people said, why are you thinking of the life sciences revolution? And I believe that this new revolution in the life sciences is going to be even more consequential than the digital revolution. It means that in the first half of the 21st century, we're going to be able to use molecules the way we use microchips. We'll be able to reprogram them in order to do things like edit our own DNA, or to make vaccines against viruses like we've done with the RNA vaccines against COVID. And I decided to do it as a narrative journey of discovery, hand in hand in a way, with this wonderful scientist named Jennifer Doudna. She's the title character of my book, The Codebreaker, because she's the one, along with her research partner, Emmanuel Charpentier, and others, who are able to show how do you break the genetic code in our body in order to edit it, to improve it, to make sure that we can get rid of genetic defects and for that matter, fight cancer, and maybe someday, and this is more controversial, add traits to our children so that we can have healthier children, maybe even taller children. We'll get to those moral dilemmas, but I want to start by telling you a little bit about Jennifer Doudna and her journey and why I picked her. When she was a young girl in Hilo, Hawaii, her father left on her bed a paperback called The Double Helix, which is a book that James Watson had written about the discovery of the structure of DNA. Jennifer was in middle school and she thought it was a detective story because she loved detective stories. And when she read it on a rainy Saturday afternoon, she discovered that in some ways she was right. It was a detective story with all sorts of clues that helped explain the mysteries of life, what happens in our body. And she realized that there was something joyful about understanding how something works, especially when that something is ourselves. She noticed in the book a character named Rosalind Franklin, who had done the imaging work that helped Watson and Crick discover the structure of DNA. And she decided, wow, I didn't know that women could become scientists. And she wanted to become a scientist. But her school guidance counselor told her, no, 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 girls don't do science. But Jennifer was committed. She persisted. She studied chemistry and biology. And eventually she goes to Pomona College and then decides she wants to go to graduate school. And she applies to University of Hawaii and a couple other places. Her dad said, well, why don't you apply to Harvard? And she said, oh, Dad, I'll never get into Harvard. And her father said, you're right. You'll never get in if you don't apply. So she applied, and to her surprise, she got in. And she got to study the molecule known as RNA. Now, at the time in the 1990s, most of the men doing biology were rushing, as she put it, to the soccer ball. They were rushing to study DNA, which is a famous molecule, the one that gets on magazine covers. But like a lot of famous people or famous molecules, it doesn't actually do that much work. It sits in the nucleus of our cell, curating information, and it takes the RNA to actually go out and do some work. RNA takes a little bit of information from the DNA in our nucleus of our cells and goes out to the region of the cells where proteins are built and oversees the building of a protein. She discovered how it did that and the structure of RNA, just like Watson and Crick had discovered the structure of DNA. And what she discovered is how RNA can sometimes replicate itself. And her advisor said, always ask the big questions. And she said, well, what's the big question here? And he said, how did life begin? And so she uses her knowledge to figure out that in the stew of chemicals 4 billion years ago on this planet, it was RNA that figured out how to replicate itself, and it became the beginning of life on this planet. She was introduced to this notion of CRISPR by another woman biologist who was then at Berkeley, where Jennifer had gone to teach. And it was about a system that bacteria use to fight viruses. What they do is they take a mugshot of any virus that attacks them, and they put it in the clustered repeated sequences that they have in their DNA, hence the name CRISPR. And if the virus comes back and attacks again, the bacteria is able to recognize it and chop it up, use a scissors to cut it. That's pretty useful to understand when we're getting attacked by wave after wave of virus. But what Jennifer did with Jillian Banfield and then another scientist named Emmanuel Charpentier from Paris is they figured out, how do you repurpose this tool? How do you reprogram it so it won't just cut the DNA of a virus, it'll cut our own DNA. It'll be able to edit our DNA wherever we want. And so they were able to do it. Just this past year, she won the Nobel Prize for that amazing discovery. But with that discovery came some unintended ethical challenges. She had a nightmare right after she made that discovery that somebody asked her to come visit so that she could explain how her new technology worked. And when she gets into the room, the person looks up and it's Hitler. And so she recoils. And she said, for weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. So Jennifer gathered groups of scientists from around the world to figure out, how should we use CRISPR? Can we use it where we focus on curing diseases, but not use it to enhance our children? Can we use it so that we can focus on living patients, but not make inheritable edits that'll be inherited by others in the species? And they've been able to create some rules of the road. But in 2018, a Chinese scientist who had been to some of Jennifer's seminars created, without authorization, the first CRISPR babies. He edited early stage embryos so that they would not have the receptor that made them susceptible to the virus that causes AIDS. There was a lot of shock because there had been an agreement that we weren't going to do inheritable edits in early stage embryos or reproductive cells. And the scientist was actually put in jail by the Chinese, who've been part of this international consensus to say, let's just use it to cure diseases. But in some ways, that meant the gene or the genie was out of the bottle because it had already been done. Now we have to figure out, how are we going to think about these type of treatments? And for me, it begins with saying, let's not slam on the brakes, because this is a godsend to the human species. It can help us fight the coronavirus, because just a year ago, Jennifer and the scientists at Berkeley, as well as her rivals and competitors at MIT and Harvard, turned their attention on using this tool for detection technologies for COVID, and eventually for ways to edit us to be less susceptible to the coronavirus, just like the Chinese scientists did for the virus that causes AIDS. But what we have to do, I think, is say to ourselves, there's certain genetic conditions that are truly necessary for us to try to conquer. All creatures, large and small, use various tricks in their playbook in order to make themselves healthier and make sure their children survive. So there are about 7,000 easy diseases that have simple genetic causes, such as sickle cell. Somebody was cured of sickle cell just this last year for the first time, totally cured genetically by using CRISPR. There are other blood diseases like that. There's Tay-Sachs, there's cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy. And even though sometimes people say, isn't this messing with Mother Nature? Should we really be doing this? Every day, I can show you on my phone. Today, I got about 6 or 7 of them from people who've read my book and say, here's a picture of my grandchild. She's 12. Or here's a picture of my son. He's 9. And he or she has this genetic condition. And they say that he's going to die in 3 years. Or they say she'll never be able to walk and her muscles will disintegrate. Can you get me in touch with Jennifer Doudna? Can you help me? So I want to see this technology proceed and go. But I also want to make sure that we focus on these type of diseases we can cure and things like coronavirus so that we don't have another pandemic. But we don't do things like allow the rich to make their children taller and thus encode into our own species the inequalities we already have and make it like Brave New World or the movie Gattaca. I also want to make sure that we don't edit out the diversity in our species. You can look at the balcony right behind me. It overlooks Royal Street here in the French Quarter. And I stand on that balcony and I look at people passing by in the crazy French Quarter here. And there are people short and tall and skinny and fat and straight and gay and trans and black and white and Creole and deaf and hearing enabled and all sorts of people. And I realize there'll be a temptation, especially among pushy parents, to say, I want my kid to be taller. I want this kid to have more muscle mass. I want to make sure about this, about eye color, hair color, sexual orientation, whatever it may be. And I think before we go down that path, we have to, too, appreciate the diversity of our society, which makes us creative, makes us human, gives us empathy, but also makes us resilient as a species. So, all of these things are things that I look at when we figure out what should be our moral attitude to having this new tool. It's almost like we're Prometheus snatching fire from the gods, or Adam and Eve taking the apple from the tree of knowledge in the garden east of Eden. And by doing that, we've given our species a certain power that no species has had before, which is to edit our own genes, to hack our own evolution. The one thing we can't do is edit ourselves to be wiser. That's something we're going to have to do together. It's a slippery slope, but all slopes are slippery. And as we go down this path of figuring out what we should use this technology for, we should do it cautiously, step by step, and hand in hand, because that makes slopes a little bit less slippery. And as we do it, we can focus on this great promise of having ways to fight viruses, ways to fight cancers, ways to fight genetic defects, but also make sure we do it in a way that's equitable, that's just, and that preserves the diversity of our species. That's why I wrote this book. It's not going to be up to politicians to decide this, I hope. It's not going to be up to the scientists even. It's going to be up to us. And by us, I mean, Tim and me and all of you listening. We're all going to have some feel for what these genetic tools can do so that we can be part with our children of the moral debate of how we're going to use them in the future. So that's why I wrote this book, and I hope that if you read it, you start a conversation about it. Thank you.
That is a terrific summary of a 500-page book in 15 minutes.
Well, there's a lot left in the book and some wonderful, colorful stories. So I urge people to still read it rather than use that 15-minute Cliff Notes.
Oh, exactly. One of the things that I was astonished by is the competitive spirit of these scientists. You referred just now to the rivalry between Berkeley and the Broad at Harvard and MIT. I had no idea that there was this competitive spirit among the scientists. And it actually, by the end of the book, it appears that was a generative competition. It was necessary in a way.
You know what? People said of Jennifer Doudna, wow, she's competitive. And I say, do you mean that as a compliment? Because sometimes people say to women, oh, they're so competitive, and they mean it not to be a compliment. Well, I like the fact that they're competitive. I like the fact that Jennifer and Jillian Banfield and Emmanuel Charpentier were working around the clock 7 days a week to win the race to figure out how to use CRISPR. And that Feng Zhang and others and George Church at Harvard and MIT were doing the same. Competition spurs us forward, whether it's in business or whether it's opening a grocery store and wanting to have a better vegetable display than the store down the road, or whether it's in science. But I do think, and I have it in the book, the stories where the competition gets a little bit out of hand. They're still fighting over the patents for CRISPR. And they were fighting over prizes, although Jennifer and Emmanuel ended up winning the Nobel Prize. One of the good things, though, in my book is a year ago, Jennifer had dropped her son Andy off at a robot building competition in Fresno. And COVID was starting to spread. And at 2 a.m, she wakes up, nudges her husband, says, we got to get up. We got to get in the car. We got to go pick up Andy. I don't want him in this conference center with this pandemic starting to spread. Now, Andy's an only child, so he was like pretty not happy when his mom arrives at the robot competition. But as they're leaving the parking lot, they get a text message that says, robot competition canceled, all kids go home. And that's when Jennifer decided she had to turn her attention to COVID. And as I said, she helped create detection technology that we're going to have home kits, like home pregnancy kits, that use CRISPR to detect not only COVID, but strep throat and other viruses or bacterial infections or cancers or the microbiome of your gut, whether it's got the right bacteria or not. And Feng Zhang did it at MIT, and others were doing it at Harvard. And when they started to use these technologies to fight CRISPR, and as you know, they use these messenger RNA technology to make vaccines, what Fong Zhang at the Broad Institute did and Jennifer at Berkeley did is they published everything they discovered right away on open servers and said, we're not asserting patent rights to this. Anybody can build on it if you're going to use it to fight COVID. So I think it helped restore, even among them, because they're very competitive, a sense that yes, we care about prizes and we care about patents and we care about priority of publications. But in the end, we pursue science because it's a noble calling. It's about helping humanity. And the fight against COVID restored that to what had been a pretty competitive situation.
By the way, I want to thank you for being part of the Pfizer trial. I got my Pfizer shots, my second one just 2 weeks ago, so today I'm good to go.
Today's your liberation day.
Exactly. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up in a Pfizer trial for
Well,
virus.
as I was working with Jennifer Doudna and others to understand how RNA, which is the star molecule in my book, is so versatile, of course, I was reading about how it acts as a messenger and tells our cells what proteins to build. And there was BioNTech working with Pfizer, and there was Moderna using that basic billion-year-old function to say, let's tell our cells to build tiny fragments of the spike protein so that if we ever get hit with the coronavirus, it'll know our immune system will recognize that spike protein and kill it. And I thought, that's a miraculous thing. I want to learn more. And I noticed that here in New Orleans at Ochsner Hospital down the road, they were doing a clinical trial for the Pfizer mRNA vaccine. So I went online, I signed up, and boom, the next day they called me in. And I believe that has a larger connotation here, which is all of us do things that are our civic duty. We do jury duty, we vote, we join the PTA, we try to get involved in civic life. I think it's useful to get involved in scientific life. It's not dangerous to be in the clinical trial. My wife worried, but that's because I had to drive out Jefferson Highway to get to Ochsner Clinic, and she thinks I'm a bad driver. But the being in the clinical trial was safe, and we do things, I think, to help uh, our fellow citizens. And so I'd urge everybody. I mean, you got the Mayo Clinic there, you got all sorts of places. People should go online and just type clinical trials and see if you too can be part of citizen science.
Mhm. It's a fascinating dimension of this whole journey toward use of the CRISPR gene editing possibility was the biohackers.
Yeah.
These sort of rebels, and you kind of sing their praises in the book as
Well,
a key part of this whole process.
Well, I just talked about citizen science, meaning it's good for people to get involved, just as we do in Little League Baseball or anything else in our communities. We like to be involved. And when I wrote about the digital revolution, when I wrote a biography of Steve Jobs and a book called The Innovators, I realized that it wasn't IBM or Digital Equipment Corporation that helped bring the computer into our homes. It was people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. And they went to places like the Homebrew Computer Club, where all sorts of hackers and geeks and people would take matters into their own hands. They'd find microprocessors from Intel and they'd scrounge enough money to buy a few and they'd make their home computers. And that's how we got the personal computer revolution. And so it's interesting that some biohackers are saying, let's do some of this in our garages or in our own labs. Let's help do experiments on science. Now, I think it's much more dangerous when you're doing it with CRISPR. I write about Josiah Zayner and I say, okay, I'm not totally in favor of him trying to do CRISPR treatments to give himself more muscle mass, but I do think it will help drive the field forward. He sent me a home brewed DNA vaccine for COVID that he had made in his lab. And I have a picture in the book of him with a needle injecting it in himself. And he sent me some and said, you can use it. That's when I decided, all right, I want to be a citizen scientist, but I'm going to do it in a safer way. I'll sign up for the Pfizer trial, and I'm not going to inject myself with something done in a biohacker's garage.
The story of what Jennifer Doudna and her colleagues what they've done is really in a way the long-time conversation of nature versus nurture, and that doesn't really surface much along the way. I kept looking for more about the nurture side of things. The genetic dimensions of all this is very nature-oriented. It's determinative, and there's more to life than just our genetic makeup.
Yeah.
How did you, as an historian, as a human being, and as a person who's involved in relationships and knows personalities, and how do you deal with that, nature versus nurture?
Right. And in the book, I go in a certain part of the book, case studies, step by step. And there's a spectrum. There are things that are clearly determined by genes, such as sickle cell. That's just one letter mutation in our genes, and you get sickled blood cells that don't carry enough oxygen. Likewise, Tay-Sachs or Huntington's or cystic fibrosis. We know those are genetically determined, and that's what I said we should deal with first. There are things that are mainly genetic determined, such as eye color or hair color. That we know the genes that can help fix that or change that. And then they'll get further along the spectrum, things like height or muscle mass or other physical characteristics that are partly nature and partly nurture. Partly it's determined by genes and partly determined by your environment. And then you get into the more complex things, which is personality, intelligence, schizophrenia, manic depressiveness, bipolar disease. In the book, James Watson, who wrote The Double Helix, has a son, Rufus, who's schizophrenic. And so much so that been institutionalized, a seriously debilitating case of schizophrenia. Well, James Watson believes it's all genetically determined because having discovered the structure of DNA, as Rufus, the son, told me, my dad tends to look at things through the lens of genetics as opposed to nature. But those are complicated issues. And so I don't think anytime soon we should be messing with things in which maybe there are genes that do dispose us to having schizophrenia or dispose people to having being bipolar. But that's such a complex mix, not just of nature and of nurture, but also of chance sometimes, of just random things. And so this is where humility comes in.
Watson is an interesting case in point of a person who understands this better than any of us, how genetics work. But he has this, what some might describe as a dark side.
Very, very dark side.
He leans in the direction of eugenics, of creating good genes in people, and the racist implications of some of what he's said publicly. That's when we get into the ethical dark side of this work.
Yeah, certainly eugenics.
Watson emerges in the story as a rather, I would say by the end of the book, a rather pathetic character, cut off from his community and isolated, and then you just. Is there a Watson stream still flowing in the science among the scientists you've got to know?
Yeah, James Watson is a very complex case. Somebody who made one of the most important discoveries, along with Rosalind Franklin and Francis Crick, which is how DNA transmits our genes. But then he goes to the dark side. He becomes so genetically fixated that he starts saying things that are racist or that he believes in genetic determinism, as his schizophrenic son Rufus says, and that differences of IQ are totally genetically determined, something that other scientists say is wrong. And it does bring up the very dark side of genetic manipulation, which is eugenics, which is something that happened in the United States at the Cold Spring Harbor lab, where Watson later became director in the early 1900s, and then certainly in Germany in the 1930s. We know the dark side of eugenics, and we know the dark side of believing that certain attributes are ingrained and genetic, such as IQ, and how that can be used uh, for discriminatory purposes. But there's another danger of eugenics, which is what I would call the free market eugenics, which is not government mandating some form of genetic selection, but giving that power to all parents or all rich parents, let's say, people can afford it, to say, what genetic traits do I want to have in my kids? And then, if you, in the privacy of a clinic in which you are handed a shopping list from the genetic supermarket, if you can choose the sexual orientation of your kid, if you can choose the IQ of your kid, or think you can, even though I don't think you can, or the skin color or hair color or whatever, are we going to edit out some of the marvelous diversity in our society? And that's one of the things I warn about in the book.
The other thing that's pretty clear in the book is this: the scientists are wary of government intervention, of legislation toward limiting or putting guardrails on their work. And how the Chinese scientist doing what he did with the CRISPR kids. I mean, that there was lack of enforcement of these guardrails that the scientific community had bought into, and kind of a compact among themselves. What's to stop that from happening again?
Well, I do think that we as a society can do it. Meaning, it's not just the scientists. As I said, we shouldn't leave it to them. But if we as a society say, here's the way we should handle this, I think, first of all, we can have FDA regulations. The Chinese are working with the US and the UK and Europe to say what are the national academies of science going to permit and not permit. And yeah, there'll be certain people who go rogue. But if we as a society say, don't break in line when it comes to getting your COVID vaccination, don't jump the queue, don't buy your vaccine before your time has come up, then yeah, there'll be people who somehow game the system, but most of us won't. And I think that's the hope. And that's why I wrote this book, is I think all of us should have a sense of what we think is proper and what we don't think is proper. Then we should have our politicians maybe put rules and regulations on medical treatments and use of these things in medical labs, and on the research that gets to be done. And we try to do it internationally, but we also do it as a society. If somebody starts bragging that they're going to buy the right to make their kid taller by 6 inches or something, I think people should just say, no, that's not done.
I should tell you that I'm 6'3", and I'm learning I have an advantage, I guess. I knew that. But I want to just remind our listeners, this is the Westminster Town Hall Forum. I'm moderator Tim Hart Anderson here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Our speaker today is historian and biographer Walter Isaacson, author of The Codebreaker, Jennifer Doudna, Gene Editing, and the Future of the Human Race. One of the things I found fascinating is your description of Dr. Doudna as being, from childhood, curious, willing to pause and to wonder. And also, she saw herself as a bit of an outsider along the way. And I think this may be something that's picked up in your other biographies of other characters.
Absolutely. Those are two characteristics I see often in the creative people I write about. Let's start with outsider. I mean, the earliest character I write about is Leonardo da Vinci. And boy, is he an outsider. He's born out of wedlock in a small village called Vinci. He's gay, he's left-handed, he's distracted, and he goes to Florence and says, "How do I fit in?" And he becomes pretty successful. But his drawing of Vitruvian Man, that self-portrait of Leonardo in the circle and the square, naked, is him saying, "How do I fit into this cosmos?" Likewise, whether you're Einstein or Henry Kissinger growing up Jewish in Germany in the 1920s, you feel like an outsider. Steve Jobs, adopted, and feeling he had been rejected by his birth parents, and trying to figure out, how do I fit in with his new family? And Jennifer Doudna, even in a lesser way, but she was a tall, lanky, blonde girl in a small town in Hawaii where everybody else in her class were of Polynesian descent, and they called her all sorts of names. So that makes you ask the question, how do I fit into this world? How do I fit into this universe? And the second trait you mentioned, Tim, is curiosity. And whether it's Leonardo da Vinci looking at how water swirls when it passes rocks and saying, why does it do that? And then studying the swirls of water and then of air and then the curls of the Mona Lisa, or Jennifer Doudna being fascinated by curls of water and how those are reflected in seashells and the curls of their shells. That is the basic curiosity. It's like Leonardo writing in his notebook, why is the sky blue? I saw that also in Einstein's notebook. Now, you and I, we see the blue sky most days, but after we've outgrown our wonder years, we quit asking, why is the sky blue? The characters I write about don't outgrow their wonder years. They don't listen when a grown-up says, quit asking so many questions. They stay curious. They stay passionately curious, obsessively curious. And as Einstein said, I'm no smarter than anybody else, he said. I'm just more curious.
In my mind, as a preacher, as a theologian, these are theological questions about the meaning of life, about the reality of the world around us, about a presence perhaps that is beyond comprehension immediately, anyway. How do you move, Jennifer Doudna moves from this pure curiosity to becoming a scientist that realizes that corporations can get into academic curiosity and monetize it in a way. I think she seemed to be reluctant at first, but now what we're seeing in academics here is this marriage between corporate America, the industrial complex of pharmacology, and academics. Is that a good thing?
Yes, in general, I think it is a good thing, and it stems after World War II, where President Truman helped set up what was really a three-legged stool, where government helped fund basic research that tended to be done at academic labs, and then corporations helped commercialize any inventions that came along. And we created a somewhat complex system, from the Dole-Buy Act to other things, that said, here's how the intellectual property works, here's how the government gets the patent rights, but how the university does, how corporations can license them, and who gets the money. And that's helped turn basic science into real inventions and products that make our lives better. The most recent example, of course, is the mRNA vaccine. Messenger RNA was studied at government labs, especially at the University of Pennsylvania and other places, and not at government labs, at university labs, often or almost all the time with government funding. And then companies like Moderna and BioNTech sprang up to commercialize it. Now, sometimes we look down on commercialization, but that ability to commercialize these products helps incent, these products to being developed. What we have to guard against is when companies get so big, they have too much power, and so there's not a real free market in it. And secondly, we have to guard against price gouging and everything else. But I think we've done that rather successfully with the COVID vaccines that came out of the basic research of messenger RNA. In Jennifer's case, after she discovers with Emmanuel and others, how do you use this tool to edit genes, she starts a little company called, Caribou, and another company called Mammoth Biosciences to do detection technology. And now they're doing work to help on the coronavirus. Well, I tend to think these companies are doing good things, and that we need to balance the possibility of making investments that give a return to companies that do it, but also making sure that big corporations don't take advantage of the system. But I'll let the reader decide that. I'm just a storyteller. I tell you the story of Jennifer's companies, the stories of the bigger pharmaceuticals, the story of Pfizer, but a small company like Moderna. And I think people should make up their own minds about how do we move things from bench to bedside. And by that, I mean the lab bench where some researcher discovers something to the bedside where a doctor gets to say, here's a drug that I think will help you.
The development of the vaccines for COVID are a good illustration of that, and that story is quite fascinating in the book. What about this is from Lisa in St. Peter, a question she asks, from your vantage point, what sorts of roles do you see ethicists needing to play, and perhaps more importantly, being able to play effectively, given the current relationships between the sciences and humanities, the monetizing of research, the role of corporations in academia?
There have been a lot of bioethicists involved in this process, especially the process at Jennifer Doudna, as well as the Chinese who have bioethicists there, I must say, and in England in particular. And I have maybe 4 chapters in the book in which the bioethicists, including the Hastings Center in the United States, but also there are many groups like that in England and Europe and even in China, that look at the ethical and religious and spiritual implications of messing with Mother Nature, or playing God, if you want to say it, and having a humility in the face of what creation has bequeathed and gifted to us. So I think there's a huge role to play, and so does Jennifer Doudna, and you'll see a whole lot of them in the book.
Mm-hmm. Another listener, Megan, asks, do you see any way of putting the genie back in the bottle regarding gene editing? The red lines that you discuss in the book, how could those ever be now drawn or redrawn or redefined? Or have we lost the red lines?
Well, we've done that with technologies in the past, even the atom bomb, which was, we crossed the line twice. And since then, so far, we've kept that back in the bottle. I think it's a little harder with gene editing because it's easier to do. There's a chapter in the book in which I call it I Learned to Edit, where I went to a lab at Berkeley and spent time learning how to edit human genes. And don't worry, I flushed it down the drain with chlorine so they didn't infect the species. It's a little bit harder to actually inject those genes into embryos and human cells, but we can pretty much regulate medical procedures. We can regulate what gets funding from government. And as a society, as I said earlier, we can say, here's what we want as a society, and here's what we don't want as a society. So you'll never have the genie totally in the bottle. There may be a clinic in the Cayman Islands, or a biohacker in a basement in Austin, Texas, or a rogue Chinese scientist who's going to do things. But fortunately, it's not quite like atom bombs. If we can prevent 95 to 99% of the bad things happening, that means we'll protect the species from this being a commonplace that would edit out a diversity and allow the rich to buy better genes. And we do that with all sorts of things we can't totally stop. I mean, trafficking in elephant tusks, shoplifting at a drugstore. If we can stop 99% of it, then we have it under control.
Right, but gene editing is, especially when you're editing material that can be inherited, it changes the human race. This is it's hardly comparable to shoplifting or elephant tusks.
Right.
This is serious, and the potential is phenomenal on the good side. Could you say more about some of the potential risks are and how, other than sort of agreement among scientists, how we're managing these risks?
Well, there are two types of risks. One are what I would call the safety risks, meaning, even the Chinese scientists, it was a pretty sloppy uh, a procedure that he did, and we don't know the unintended consequences. You take out the gene for the receptor that causes, for the virus that causes AIDS, well, that might hurt your ability to protect against West Nile disease or malaria. You start fiddling with one gene, it could have off-target effects or unintended consequences. But those problems, which are very, real, those are solvable, at least in theory. Eventually, we'll have much sharper editing tools. We'll be able to say, if you fiddle with this gene, here's what's going to happen to that. So those aren't philosophical issues. Those are just safety issues. And I think in the next decade, we'll overcome most of the safety issues. Then you get to the spiritual and philosophical issues, which is, what is it that we shouldn't touch? How humble should we be about the giftedness of our genetic allotment in nature? And how much should we try to protect ourselves using these tools? Now, every creature, great and small, in creation, uses whatever tricks it can to try to survive and have children that'll survive. And there's no reason our species should be any different. We've learned this trick from bacteria called CRISPR. Bacteria use it. There's no reason we shouldn't use it. But we have to use it wisely, because sometimes getting a new trick, a new tool, a species will lead itself into a place it doesn't want to go. It might even lead itself to its own destruction. So I think that's why we have to think about, what are we going to mess with and what aren't we going to mess with?
Kim from Plymouth sent in a question about the CRISPR kids you just referred to in China. What do we know about them? They're growing up, obviously.
They're 2.5 years old, and unfortunately, we don't know much because the doctor's been arrested. The kids are being monitored. We know that the edits were a little bit sloppy. There were some off-target effects, but it doesn't seem to have affected them. But no, we don't. Actually, they're 2.5 years old, and we don't know much about them. I hope soon we will, because from this misbegotten event, at least we should gain some knowledge.
And there is a third one, I believe, right?
Right, a third child was born. We know very little about that. All the same rogue doctor.
Uh-huh. You're a writer, a historian, a biographer. You've written about people who are alive and contributing to their industry or their fields now, like Jennifer Doudna, and you've written about people who are long since gone. What's the difference? Is it easier to do one or the other?
Well, I once wrote about Henry Kissinger, and after dealing with him for a long time and his reaction to the book, I said, I think I'll do somebody who's been dead for 250 years. So I did Ben Franklin. And once again, after Steve Jobs, that was a somewhat, tough thing. I was there when he was dying, and he was bitter and at times said things that were cruel. And, I said, okay, now I'm going to go back 500 years. And I did Leonardo da Vinci. The important thing about a Jennifer Doudna is you really get to see things happening in real time. When she turned her attention to the coronavirus, I was there. I was in her lab, but then in her Slack channels and her Zoom meetings, and same with the ones at MIT. And so the book reads more like a unfolding adventure and detective story as opposed to a history book. It kind of unfolds in real time because I'm there with the people as they're doing the experiment, and I'm not knowing how it's going to turn out, and they're not knowing how it's going to turn out. Or I'm there when they're debating the ethical consequences of making an inheritable edit that might fight coronavirus. Mm-hmm. So I think it gives me a much more real, intimate, and almost thrilling insight, because you're watching history as it happens, not just going back and reporting what happened a long time ago.
Could you explain for our lay audience, who aren't scientists mostly, we talk about the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine as if we know what they are. They come straight out of this CRISPR gene editing technology. What's the connection between the mRNA work that Jennifer Doudna and others are doing and the vaccines that are going into our arms?
Yes, RNA does two important things in my book. One is it acts as a guide that tells us how to cut DNA where we want to cut it. And that's the gene editing part. And that's a guide RNA that's attached to a scissors called an enzyme that acts like a scissors. And you say, target it right here. Chop that gene out of our DNA. And so that's guide RNA. RNA also does something that's really basic, the most fundamental thing that RNA does in life, which is it's a messenger that takes genetic information, such as a gene, something encoded in a gene, and then constructs a protein. So a messenger RNA may get the formula or the blueprint for making a hair follicle cell or a fingernail cell or a hormone or a neuron, or in the case of the vaccines, make a little bit of that spike protein that the coronavirus has. And that's used in order to stimulate our immune system so that we can fight the real coronavirus if it hits us. So what Jennifer did as a young graduate student is she focused on this miracle molecule that I love, RNA. And she studied how it acts as a gene editing tool, how it acts as a messenger, how it was the reason life began on this planet. And so I show how these miracles, these beauties of nature can be used together, because we also use CRISPR now to detect the coronavirus. We use it so it could kill the coronavirus rather than just be a vaccine for our immune system. So together, using these little molecules that we can reprogram. And here's the important thing. If the coronavirus changes, as it has been doing, and you get variants, you can just reprogram that messenger RNA and say, okay, now build it slightly differently so that it'll take on the new variant. And if you want to change the gene you want to edit, you just reprogram the molecule. So these molecules are, for our time, what microchips were for the last half of the 20th century. Something we can just recode and tell them what to do.
And therein lies the beauty of it and the danger of it, the blessing and the curse of this technology. Are we better prepared for the next pandemic because of what's happened in the scientific world in the last year?
Totally. We have crossed a major threshold, and I have the people in my book describe it, which is by fighting viruses with these new RNA vaccines. It means, as I said a moment ago, we can just reprogram them. It took only 3 days for the people at Moderna and the people at BioNTech to program in the messenger RNA to tell it how to make that spike protein. Now, it took a lot longer to test it, and to put it into delivery systems, to manufacture it. That took the other 9 months, but it was very fast. And as the chair of Moderna says in my book, we have finally, after 1 million years, turned the corner so that we have a tool that's as good as bacteria have, because bacteria do the same thing. They adapt instantly to each new wave of virus. And so by doing it, by reprogramming a messenger RNA, it means we can quickly adapt to any new virus that comes along, or any new bacteria that comes along, or to a personal cancer cell that we may have.
These questions of the ethics of these things, of how to use this technology, in some sense are political questions. I think of anti-vaxxers and the segment of American society that refuses to get vaccinated. They're suspicious of science, even one political party versus another. Do you see in the politics of the moment a helpful way forward, or are we going to be perhaps missing an opportunity here?
That's another reason I wrote this book. I think if you go hand in hand with the scientists and you know something about them, where they grew up, what book they read in sixth grade, and they're real human beings, and you watch step by step as they make some of these discoveries, it helps demystify science. I understand why people may be against GMOs, for example, but I think it helps to know what a genetically modified organism is and what the corn being grown in Minnesota is and what the yogurt makers discovered and what a gene is. And I think once you understand, well, what is a gene? And by the way, how would we change it and how would we do it in a way that makes it so it's like other genes we already know? As we understand science better, it becomes less frightening to us. And sometimes I think, I'm not just talking about anti-vaxxers or people, I'm talking about people you and I know and like who say, oh, I can't do science, or I never understood biology. Well, you would not say that about, baseball or music or art or literature. You'd think you were a Philistine if you said that. Well, science is beautiful, just like all those other things. And I hope to convey that science is something we can all try to understand, and we can be part of the moral discussion of how to use it.
Your book on Jennifer Doudna has as part of its title, The Future of the Human Race. That's enormous. Having experienced what you've experienced and met the people you've met, are you hopeful for the future of the human race?
Yes. I mean, I say it's about the future of the human race because I mean that literally, meaning we will be able to make inheritable edits to our genes, which will change our species. We can create a species that's less susceptible to viruses, or we can use it in an unwise way and create subspecies of genetically enhanced elite people and people who are genetically non-enhanced, like in the movie Gattaca or the novel Brave New World. So we have in our hands now, as if we've stolen this fire from the gods, or as if we've bitten into the apple and of the tree of knowledge, we have this new power. And the Bible, tells us, okay, biting into the apple of the tree of knowledge has consequences. And this is another case of that. And so I think I'm optimistic if we can get most people to wrap their heads around just the general idea of what does it mean to edit our genes. And that way, I think we're all generally good people. We're generally wise people. And I think we'll find ways to say, let's use this wisely. And in the meantime, let me say, because I really push back when people say, let's stop this, let's stop this. Let me show you someday those 8-year-old kids or those 12-year-old kids, the pictures I get every day, who are suffering huge problems and genetic defects and bad diseases. And think of the people you know who have cancers, and think of the people you know who have, going blind or getting Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
We don't want that. We want to make our species healthier.
The tree you refer to in Genesis is not just the tree of knowledge, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that kind of sets up the ethical
That's
question.
a wonderful line in Genesis
Yeah.
that he put also in the garden, the tree of knowledge, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But as you know better than I, that notion of us having to understand good and evil, that comes out of, the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. It really is a matter of the stewardship of the human race, which we have in our hands now. You've been listening to Walter Isaacson on the Westminster Town Hall Forum. We're very glad to have you with us today and interested in encouraging others to read your new book, The Codebreaker, about Jennifer Doudna. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Tim.